Marc Rittman is the CEO of Forte One. Marc and his colleagues typically consult with companies in distribution, manufacturing, consumer products, and business-to-business services. I think one of the interesting things about Marc's consulting firm is, and Marc will get more into this, is they work with underperforming companies, but these aren't companies that are turnaround companies that are being run by the banks. So, Marc, welcome to Mbbi, and we look forward to having you.
Well, we just heard from some very sharp fellows who have bought a whole host of businesses over the past several years, and we have a panel later today that's going to talk a little bit about why 2012 is such a great year for buying businesses, and I think indeed it is. And I would caution that it's a great year for buying businesses that have sustainable earnings and that don't have customer concentration and that don't have a lot of blemishes. But based on a lot of folks that we work with, and we have over the past dozen years worked with about 300 businesses, I would tell you that more than 2/3 of the businesses that will be coming to market in the next 7 years, which is a significant part of the professional life of most of you in the audience, they will have blemishes and that they won't be ready for market. And so what my talk today is about is the kinds of things you as advisors and accountants and deal folks, and in the case of private equity, do we have a private equity person in the room? Because we work a lot with private equity. What you need to do to get these companies ready for sale, basically. And I will tell you, that's a difficult process. And it's difficult because we're dealing with the human condition. And the very behavioral characteristics that enable entrepreneurs to start and run successful businesses also often blind them to the solutions for fixing their companies. We're going to talk about 3 things today. I'm going to start by exploring why it is that business owners, when they have underperforming businesses, and all of us have dealt with this as attorneys and accountants and investment bankers, why it is that oftentimes business owners exhibit what I would call self-destructive behavior. They can't get out of their own way, and they can't make the decisions that we as advisors see are essential to getting the business back on track. Second, it's very delicate as an advisor to know when you have a business that's really in a death spiral versus a business that's just running into some of the hills that you see all the time as businesses are going through growth. Because you certainly don't want to be Chicken Little and say the sky is falling when in fact it's not. And within Forte, we've identified 6 factors that we see in every business that we've worked on in the last dozen years, and I'll share those with you. And number 3, this is really the human condition part of it. Business owners are a tough audience, and they need to be, because having built 1, 2, 3, 4 businesses myself, I can tell you that wearing all 14 hats as a business owner is a tough road to hoe. And so it's very challenging as an advisor to know how to get a business owner to both embrace the change they need and then to put a process together where they'll stick with it until they've achieved whatever goal it is they need to achieve, including getting the business ready for sale. And I'll walk through that process because we're doing it as we speak with probably 20 businesses around the country. How many of you watch pairs figure skating in the Olympics? How many of you will admit to watching pairs figure skating? I do. I think these gals look great in those skimpy little leotards, but it's just me. There's a move called the death spiral, which you've probably seen, where the male skater sweeps the woman ever closer to the ice. And I think oftentimes of the business processes that sometimes lead to underperformance as being a little bit like a death spiral as they get ever closer to the ice. And the issue here for advisors in the audience, and most of you are, and deal folks, is you want to arrest that descent before the business owner gets stuck. And what do I mean by stuck? Here's the litmus test. When the business owner is overcome by events and is no longer having fun running the business, and I would just pause here for a moment and say, how many of you who are accountants or attorneys have any customers that aren't having fun in their companies anymore? You know you all do, sure. And then the second part of this litmus test is, have the decisions they've made to correct the descent actually worked? Because when they stop working and they're not having fun, that's when you have a stuck owner. When I began, I said the challenge here is oftentimes that the very behavioral characteristics that enable people to start businesses also blind them to the issues that they need to grasp to get out of that descent. Well, this is where trusted advisors come in. And I will tell you that in the absence of trusted advisors who can have an authentic conversation with business owners, many of these businesses will head right on out to the ice because you are the male part of that pair skater that has to pull them out of that descent. And we're going to talk about why. I think all of us have read enough behavioral studies to know that many decisions that we make in life are not very logical, because Homo sapiens are pattern-driven organisms. How many of you take a fairly similar route to work every day? Yeah. Driving an automobile on that fairly similar route to work, you are making hundreds and probably thousands of decisions. And they're autonomic decisions. You don't think about too many of them until something like a child gets in your path. And boom, you hit the brakes just like that. Do you think about that decision? Of course you don't. It's automatic because we know that pattern. When a business owner gets in trouble, the decisions they're making are, in many cases, autonomic, because it's been demonstrated that when we're under stress, we tend to switch to a different mode of decision making. And I will tell you that business owners consider their business to be a lot like their children. It's their identity. And when you start to lose control of something that's as essential to you as your very identity, it is a high-stress situation. So let's examine how human beings make decisions under high-stress situations. Kubler-Ross did the pioneering research in this realm. And she started out with her book on death and dying, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. She did another one called On Grief and Grieving. And what this was about was how do human beings react either when they find out they have a terminal illness or they're going to suffer some catastrophic loss. When business owners lose control or lose profitability or no longer have the ability to direct a turnaround themselves of a business that has been the very fiber of their being, that is a catastrophic loss. And what kind of behavior should we expect? These are the 5 phases of grieving that Kubler-Ross had laid out, but I'll tell you, I see them every day as we work with clients. It starts out with denial. My company's fine. This is just like every other bump in the road I've hit, and I can fix this on my own. And then when that doesn't work, the owners start to say, I'm not having fun now. I'm going to deflect the blame. It must be coming from someone but me. Then they move into, and this can take place over many months, and then they move into something that she calls bargaining. At Forte, we call it the ship on the horizon. And what that means is there's always an answer to this issue. There is a customer contract that's been delayed for 6 months, and when that comes in, my business will be fixed. Or there is a new person that I'm going to hire, or a competitor that's going to go out of business. And when that doesn't happen, then you move to depression. And this is when the owner starts to, you'll recall the graph where the owner was stuck. This is when the owner is beyond stuck, because now they're saying, I don't know what to do with my business, but it's not going well. And finally, they might move to the fifth phase, which is acceptance of saying, you know what? I'm not omnipotent. I'm not omnipotent. Maybe someone else, maybe I need another voice in this conversation. But I will tell you, most business owners don't reach that fifth stage. And the reason they don't reach that fifth stage is because they believe that their company is so unique that no external advisor can really help them. In their heart of hearts, they don't believe an external advisor can really help them. So they never get to acceptance. And they go through this little do loop. And who can pull them out of that do loop? Well, that would be you. And we're going to talk about how that will work. I think Einstein said it best when he said, difficult problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking with which they were created. This is exactly what happens when a business owner and even a team of senior leaders take a business down that road to getting stuck and underperformance. But there's a dark side to being an advisor of an underperforming business. And the dark side is this. You need to make darn sure that you're not saying the sky is falling, when in fact, what the company is experiencing is just another bump in the road. Because, you know, for those of us who've worked with businesses over the past several decades, you know darn well it's a bumpy ride up. So how can you as an advisor distinguish between this is a normal bump in the road versus my client is really in trouble? Well, I'll tell you, there are really two factors here. The first is the human factor, and the second is the business factor. There's a great book by Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, and the first sentence in that book I think is pretty relevant to what we do. And it starts out, the book starts like this: healthy families are all alike, but every unhealthy family is unhealthy in its own way. The same is true with businesses. Boy, when they're ready to sell, they all look alike. They're sustainable, they can protect those earnings, everybody wants that deal, they go for high multiples. The majority of businesses do not look like that, and they're not going to look like that over the next 7 years. But there are some common elements in dysfunctional businesses. And the first is how the owners feel about their current situation. And I will tell you that with dysfunctional businesses, you see these kinds of symptoms. And I know we could all list a whole host of symptoms that you see. But the litmus test is really these two things. Is the client not having fun anymore? And have they run out of solutions? Because then, as an advisor, you have to know, you know what? We may have an issue here. That's certainly a yellow flag. Now I'm going to talk about the red flags, which are what actually do we see in all of the businesses that we work with. And within Forte, we've identified something that we call the 6-factor analyses. And this is a sword that cuts both ways, because when businesses don't have these factors present, they're probably on the road to ruin. When they do have all of them present, Well, these are the kinds of companies that buyers will stand up and salute at. These are the companies where you can run a great process and get a lot of interested buyers. But let me give you examples of what we find with underperforming companies. The first factor is a focus strategy. We're working with a national contracting firm. It's a $300 million business. They're all over the country. And 7 years ago, this business made $20 million a year. And then they started this gradual decline, and in 2010, for the first time in their history, they lost money. And that was the catalyzing event that caused the board to allow their attorney to contact us. One of the first things we do is we interview the senior leadership team, and we ask them about this very thing. Tell us about your strategy for 2011 and 2012 that is going to arrest this decline. And they all had very specific opinions about strategy. But none of them had the same opinions. We got strategies all over the board from this team. And when you see that in a company, that is a key indicator of a company that's headed for underperformance. The second factor, strong leadership. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I mean a senior leadership team that can sustain the business in the absence of a founder. We're working with a $30 million distributor of high-tech gear right here in the Midwest. And they had had a very profitable business up until about 2010. And then they hit a real wall. Well, we went into this company, and in a couple of days, the issue became very clear. And here was the issue. They started literally out of their garage. They had a team of friends that they put this business together with. They're now a $30 million company 4 years later. Who do you suppose their senior leadership team is? Exactly. It's that same team of friends. The business outgrew the talents of the senior leadership team. A key indicator of an underperforming business. In September of 2008, I got a phone call from a fellow who owned a good-sized company, $250 million business. I'll never forget this call because I guess it's like getting a call at 2 a.m. from your child, and you say, whoa, what's going on here? I knew that this business owner was in distress. And he said to me, he said, Mark, look, I don't know you, but I've heard about your firm, and here's my situation. It's taking us 45 days to close our books. This is in September. He said, I just found out I lost $2 million in July. I don't think we had a very strong August, and our September isn't looking too good, and I'm concerned that I might be sitting on an $8 million loss. That would get my attention as well. So I hopped on a plane and spent the next 2 days with Ed and his wife. When businesses do not have the metrics to make sound decisions, and they're not closing their books within, I would say, a maximum of 5 business days, I don't care how complex the business is. I've seen it done. When they don't have that, that is a key indicator of future underperformance. The fourth, efficient operations. What I really mean by that is, are you running your business by the numbers? Do you have key performance indicators that enable you to know where you're really making money? We were brought in by a prominent Chicago family that happens to own a manufacturing company with 3 factories in the Midwest. And they said to me, Mark, here's the issue. Our factories are just not up to snuff. We need you to go in and fix our factories. And we said to them, could you humor us? Because that's not how we get started with engagements. The first thing we need to do is we need to look around and just get a flavor for the business. We call this a business assessment. And within the first 3 days, our team came back in and said, we need to get with this client because what we're learning is something very different than what they told us. What we learned is this company is a private label manufacturer. They work for 19 companies. We learned that they were losing money on 13 of those relationships, and they didn't know it. Why? Because they did not have KPIs that enabled them to really understand where this business was making money. That's the fourth key indicator of underperformance. The fifth is a high-performing sales organization, and by that I mean not great individual sales people, but do you have sales leadership that understands number one, which is the strategy of the business, and how they're executing against it. We were hired by a PE firm a couple years ago that owned a high-end audio brand, a brand that all of us would know. And when we got into this company and started talking to the senior leadership team, we realized that all these guys were our age. What's wrong with that picture? Here's what's wrong with that picture. Did you have one of these when you were buying a lot of albums? How many of you went, yeah. How many of you went to college with, in my case, stolen crates of the milk crates that you put all your LPs in? Raise your hand. Yes, we all did, right? Well, you know, I sent my daughter to college out east, and she had more albums than I ever owned on this, right? Okay, so how did that translate to the dysfunction in their sales team? You know where they were selling to? Independent high-end audio dealers. How many of you can name 3 independent high-end audio dealers in the Chicagoland area? You can't, because there might be, I don't know them, but we go to Best Buy, we're buying from Amazon, we're buying from category killers. But they were dinosaurs in how they went to market. And incidentally, do you know their number one client? Their number one client was Fifth Avenue out of New York. But they sort of, you know, did the, what's the cross you do with, you know, go away? They said, we can't do any more of that because we're going to cannibalize these high-end audio dealers. And we said to them, stop everything. You have to have an entirely different selling strategy. The good news is that they embraced it. They got some fresh blood in their sales organization. And that PE firm just sold that company for an 8 times earnings. So you can change things. And the last factor that we find in underperforming companies is an inability to scale the company. And by that I mean, do you have a number of people in the firm with a lot of tribal knowledge, and you're dependent on that tribal knowledge when you either have to downsize or upsize the firm? We're working in a plant right now in West Virginia. And this is a company that has 6 plants. And this particular plant makes subassemblies for Caterpillar. Okay, well, there's hundreds of companies that make subassemblies for Caterpillar in the United States. But Cat came to them at the end of 2010 and said, boy, have we got a deal for you. We're going to extend your contract for 3 more years, and we need you to double your production within 90 days. And they said, we can do it, where do we sign? Well, what happened? Fast forward through 2011, they got further and further and further behind on their promises to Caterpillar. This company is now in market. It went in market at the end of 11. We got called in at the end of 11 by an investment banker that we work with, and he said, oh, Mark, I don't think it would be such a hot idea if we go to market with a company that has 5 rocking factories and one that has a customer that's very unhappy with them. How can we fix this? So we went into the factory, and what we found was this. They had great people in this factory, 2 of them in the group of 150. And they were working their living, loving heads off. But 2 people cannot scale an operation of that size. They also had a great ERP system that they weren't using. There were all these Excel spreadsheet workarounds. This is a key indicator of underperformance. Those are the 6 factors. And I'll tell you that when you have companies that hit on all those cylinders, it's a beautiful thing. And buyers think it's a beautiful thing as well. But, and I think, Linda, I promised you that we have a tool within Forte. It's called a 6-factor analysis, and it's on a spreadsheet. And any of you who want it, just give me your card or tell Linda, and we will have that emailed out to you post haste. And advisors use it oftentimes to allow their clients to self-assess their business, because oftentimes clients never really look at all 6 of these factors because they're so focused on a few things. But it's an eye-opener when it takes them about 15 minutes when they walk through this analysis, and often they'll come to you and say, gee, we probably do need to do a few things before we put this business in market. But back to underperforming companies. The real challenge that we have found with business owners, even once you've identified the issues that they need to work on, is causing them to embrace the need for change and causing them to stick with it until they've actually made the changes you need to get the company in market. A good friend of mine had a daughter some years ago who they found out was addicted to drugs. And this was a real wake-up call for the family. And so the family went to counseling along with the daughter. There was as much counseling for the parents as there was for the daughter. And one of the questions that came up in the process was, what do you do if you find drugs in your house, in your daughter's room, or in the bathroom? Anybody, what do you think the answer to that is? Anybody? You call the police. How about that? You call the police on your own daughter. Otherwise, what you're doing is you are condoning the habit. Why am I bringing that up here? Because as an advisor, I see a lot of advisors that are very conscious of the challenges that are going on with their customers. But they're afraid to, quote, call the police and have a fierce conversation with their clients because they're afraid of losing the business. And I would just play devil's advocate here and say, if you're really going to be a trusted advisor, is it appropriate for you to watch them fly that plane right into the ground? Or should you intervene in a very substantive way? And I think the answer to that's pretty apparent. And there's really two pieces here that are critical. And I put Shrek up here for a reason. Is there anybody here that hasn't seen Shrek? You don't have children. Okay. Well, and then I would ask a different question. Is there anyone that will admit to seeing Shrek a dozen times with their multiple children? Yeah. Okay, we have some honest people in the room. But the reason I put Shrek up here is, you remember in the original movie, there was a point in the movie where Shrek's talking to Donkey, and he says, an ogre is like an onion. And his point was that you can't really know somebody until you understand what their motives are. And we believe in Forte, and I think you would acknowledge it, that especially with privately held businesses, everyone has businesses for their own reasons. And a business exists to support the needs of its owners. Think about that. A business exists to support the needs of its owners. Except most owners don't know why they have the business. And that seems really counterintuitive. but I'll tell you, I've gone through day-long processes with owners. We insist on doing this before we'll take an engagement to understand what they're trying to get out of the business. We had a client, this is not too atypical, and he had a big business, over $200 million. And he told me, he said, you know, Mark, we never thought we would end up with a business that was this big. We started this business so that we could be close to our children and not be working in some corporate environment where we had a 2-hour commute. He said, what I really want out of life, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, he said, what I really want out of life, and the reason I want to sell this business now, is I want to be able to influence the religious education in our churches' colleges. And that was extremely important to this man. And so that became the true north for the whole change process. And I would tell you that finding the true north of your clients with underperforming businesses is worth the effort. And I'm not talking about a lunch where you have a casual conversation. We've put a process together. I'll be happy to share it with anyone here. And it's very effective. It's called structured scenario scoring. But what it's really about is understanding and helping owners understand why they have the business. Because change is tough. And there will be many times in the change process, and there was with Ed, the Seventh-day Adventist fellow, there was many times when I had to sit him down and say, Ed, look, stick with this, because this is about you achieving your dream. Fast forward, it's about 20 months after we started, he sold that business for 9 figures. You know what he's doing now? Traveling the world, influencing the curricula at Seventh-day Adventist colleges. So it can work, but it's critical to find the true north. And once you establish the true north, then what do? Because now you've stepped into the breach. I would tell you that this is really where the fun begins, because in most cases, and I'll go to the next slide, I would tell you that we've worked on hundreds of businesses, and I have never seen a case where the management team that authored the company getting into trouble was the same team that could come up with the best get-well plan. Why is that? Well, because they're human, and because my father used to say, he was a businessman, Mark, the difference between a rut and a groove is depth. And most of the times when you have underperforming businesses in your portfolio, people are in a rut. Now, you need another voice in the conversation. And whether it's a company like Forte, whether it's you, whether it's some other business advisor, these are the kinds of characteristics that we have found really resonate with business owners. First, you need high emotional intelligence. Why? Because you're working with the business owner, and you're working in an environment where there's a lot of angst. Because remember, these are folks under stress. And so you have to be, or whomever you put into this business has to be the calm in the storm. Second, I often think of small businesses, and by small I mean the companies we work with are between about 20 million and 300 to 400 million. They are delicate organisms. And you don't have the luxury of going into these companies and just working on sales, or just working on finance, or just working in the factory. Because if you do that, it's the old Hippocratic oath. You can do real harm to the business. So anybody that comes into that company needs to have the whole gestalt of the company and probably of the industry as well. This is one of the reasons why the majority of our people are ex-CEOs who have built 3 or 4 companies. We don't send wet behind the ear in people, and I wouldn't recommend that you suggest folks go in that don't have experience building companies in that industry. And finally, this is no time for on-the-job training. They have to have authored similar change in their own firm or firms. They have to essentially be repeating for the customer what they've already done in their own businesses. And this graph looks a little bit complex, but it's not. There's really only 3 things I want you to take away. And this is the process for actually getting it done. The first is, it begins and ends with the owner's true north. If you're going to author change with an entrepreneur who is under stress because he or she has an underperforming business, it's all about what they need. It's all about what they need. The second point is, don't expect them to be able to tell you what they need. They can't. They can give you the symptoms they're experiencing, but we get back to the old Einstein quote, which is, difficult problems need a higher level of thinking. So you've got to find another voice that can come into this company and do a 360 and figure out what they really need and author a get well plan. And the third piece we have found in doing a lot of these over the past 12 years is that the advisor, whether it's an attorney, an accountant, an investment banker, a wealth manager, someone who is well known and trusted by that business owner, needs to stay involved the entire time. We've had people that refer us into business say, okay, that was great, let us know how it's going. And we sort of grab them by the lapels and say, you're not going anywhere. You have to be part of this process because change is tough and the owner will waver. And so we found that by putting a team together that includes the advisors, you have a much better chance of actually getting to the finish line. So, key points. The first is this. In the absence of a trusted advisor, many owners of underperforming businesses, especially in this generation coming through, I mean, there's a lot of guys in their 60s and 70s now that are waking up and saying, I would like to sell my business. In the absence of, you're seeing it, right? In the absence of a trusted advisor, if their business is underperforming, it will continue to underperform. Second point, most business owners don't know where to turn for help. And how do I know this? When I started Forte a dozen years ago, after I sold some businesses that I had built, I didn't know if this was a logical business idea, so I asked people this question. I asked folks in Chicago, overseas, in California. Here was the question. I said, it's Sunday afternoon. You get a call from a client, and the call goes something like this. My spouse, who runs our family business, just had a heart attack on the golf course. Who can you recommend run? Oh, we have no number 2. Who can you recommend to me to run the company starting Monday? And you know what I learned from those conversations? There is no go-to company. There is no go-to company. And so business owners don't have go-to resources when they need to turn to someone to get help. Second point, there are predictable signs. We've walked through them. And most of the businesses, the underperforming businesses we work with, they don't have just one of those 6 factors. They've got 3 or 4 or 5 or all of those factors going on simultaneously. And yet they're still making money, but less money every year. Next point. You guys play a pivotal role. And in fact, as I said before, without you and without you recommending someone appropriate, this play is not going to end well. And finally, the kinds of resources that tend to play well with business owners, high EQ, have worked in the industry, and have authored similar change in their own companies. Benjamin Franklin was once asked, how do companies go bankrupt? And his answer was, slowly at first, and then all at once. And my wish for you in 2012 is that if you follow these best practices, that none of your clients will go bankrupt all at once. Did everybody hear the question? How do you bridge the gap? And I like the way you stated it, where since it's so personal, since a business is such a personal entity to a business owner, how can you say that your child isn't a Nobel laureate, exactly, in essence, right? That is flawed. And I think the first thing that we certainly do with business owners is we don't talk about the business. We talk about what the owner wants from the business. So we establish a true north. And as I said, that's so critical that I won't put our people in harm's way on an engagement until I know that. Because that then takes the owner away from their business and focuses on why they have the business. The second thing we do is, and we call this social permission, and social permission is where you give people examples of all the other kinds of businesses that have had issues similar to this, so that they recognize that every business has dirty laundry. Because I think this is one of the reasons why I've actually had owners say, Mark, I have to spend a few months cleaning things up before we can bring you in. You kind of go, what? What they're really saying is, I'm embarrassed. And so these are generally people who aren't aware of the fact that every business has dirty laundry. My businesses have all had dirty. Everyone in here who's a businessman knows that you go home at night recognizing that there's 20 things you could be doing, except that you need a little sleep, right? So that's what we do. And I find that when you do those two things, then you can have legitimate discussions about the real issues in the business and start working on solutions, because you've depersonalized it by saying everybody has issues like this. You need an authentic intervention. You need a fierce conversation. And people generally, when you have those conversations, they don't want to hear that conversation, but they'll go back and process it and say, you know what? This advisor is being honest. And oftentimes, especially people that they're fairly well off and you know, have big staffs, they're accustomed to not getting the truth. And for those of you who've read the book Trusted Advisor, you know that the thing that really defines great trusted advisors is authenticity. And there's a way that you can have those conversations so that you're not being pejorative, you're just being factual. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had like that, and people don't often like to hear it, but you're just telling the truth. Yeah, did everyone hear that? One possibility is to call in an outside advisor like an HR firm and have them do an assessment. What we have found is that there are actually times when to the outside world it appears that there's poor performance, but it all depends on what the owners want from the company. Because profit maximization with privately held companies is often not the reason they have the company. And I have known firms, big firms, where they've said, I'm creating a place for my children to work. And it's more important that their children have a place to work than that the family's fortunes be maximized. And so that's why, again, I get back to the point I made. Find the true north. Make sure you discover that before you start to author any sort of a change process, because you are working at the behest of the owner.